Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We will now be starting our meeting for today. And I would like to call upon Ian to introduce our guest speaker.
Yes, thank you, Don. It's definitely a pleasure to introduce my good friend, Paul Mills. Paul has a long and storied career in music. While he was studying engineering at Western in the 60s, he was a performing musician and was part of several locally successful groups, including the Balladeers. The lure of folk music was too strong, and Paul's aspirations of a career in engineering were abandoned. He went on to have an incredible career as a radio producer, record producer, songwriter, performer, and a very solid volunteer for many organizations, including being the recent chair of Home County Music and Art Festival, and also taking significant roles in other arts organizations over the years. He produced Touch the Earth on CBC with host Sylvia Tyson, produced most of Stan Rogers' albums, and is one of the founding partners of Borealis Records. He is a recipient of the Order of Canada, and last year was inducted into the London Music Hall of Fame. So it is indeed a pleasure to have Paul with us today, and take it away, Paul.
Thanks very much, Ian, for that introduction, and thank you, Rotary Club of London, for the opportunity to speak with you today. Today I want to share with you some stories of my life's journey and how one's direction can be affected so deeply by circumstances, people, and how closely you follow what your heart is telling you to do. You're looking at a guy who has a master's degree in chemical engineering, but he spent the last 50 years of his life carving out a significant career in the music business. Now, how in the hell did that happen, you might ask? Well, let me tell you. Music has always been an important ingredient in my life. In high school at Oak Ridge Secondary here in London, I always had a musical group going. There was my folk band that Ian mentioned called the Balladeers, which did a lot of Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul and Mary stuff. And I was even in a rock and roll band called the Viscounts for a little while. I graduated from high school in 1964. Back then, all Ontario grade 12 students took what was called a SATO test, stood for Scholastic Aptitude Test of Ontario. The tests measure your aptitude in various subjects taught in the Ontario school system and were meant to provide guidance to students as they were deciding on potential career paths and their next steps in education. Great idea, but as it turned out, it kind of sent me in the wrong direction. After the test was completed and scored, I was ushered into a meeting with one of the guidance counselors at Oak Ridge. He told me how I scored so well in math and science and the arts. The thing everyone knows, he said, though, is just how hard it is to make a living in the arts. So my advice to you is to pursue a career that your math and science skills will serve you well in. I think engineering would be your best choice. In fact, since your strongest abilities seem to be in chemistry, I would recommend chemical engineering as your ideal profession. Yes, sir, says I, and off I go. I enrolled in the engineering school at Western University, and in second year chose my specialty, chemical engineering. I enjoyed university life, particularly the musical events and clubs that were happening, but stuck to my studies. In my third year, in 1966, I met someone who became the most important person in my life's journey. Let me tell you how. One day, something appeared in the university newspaper, the Gazette, which caught my eye. There was an article about something called Cupid Computer, in which you would fill out a form with questions about your interests, personality, and looks, what kind of date you were seeking, and all that stuff. You could then send in the form along with $3, and they would send you back the names and phone numbers of 3 potential people who would be a good match for you. Remember, this is 1966, computer dating in the Stone Age. Well, I filled in the form and I sent it off with my $3, and the 6 cents postage, and soon got my 3 names. The first date wasn't that great, but number 2 was this beauty. I took Bev Spence to the Campus Hi-Fi restaurant, which is still there on Richmond Street, for our first date, and we hit it off. A year later, I proposed to her, and we were married in the summer of '68, our graduating year. In that year, with my engineering degree in hand, I landed a job with Procter & Gamble, and Bev and I moved to Hamilton. A few months into the job, it was clear that it wasn't for me. One day I announced to Bev that I wasn't really that turned on by soap, and basically hated my job, and I wanted to return to Western to get a PhD and become a university professor. Why? Because I loved university life, especially the music. Bev, bless her heart, supported my decision, and in the summer of '69, we moved back to London. I enrolled in a PhD program doing research into the fluid dynamics of certain chemical reactors called fluidized beds. Here's a picture of me in my lab. I worked hard at this and the courses but music continued to be a major draw for me. The thing is that during those years, it was the music scene here in London was starting to really explode. There was a wonderful club on campus called The Hub, and an organization at Western University called the Folk Music Society, which I became involved in. In fact, I was president of it for 1 year. We would meet monthly at Luther House on Richmond Street, just opposite the gates, and there would be a concert, and there would be lots of jam sessions. Then in 1970, downtown on Clarence Street, two brothers named John and Bob Smale started a folk music club called Smale's Pace. It was built in a building that used to be an ambulance garage and later a Bell Canada garage. Here's a couple of pictures of it under construction. That's John Smale standing at the door there. By the way, John is a Rotarian. He lives in Belleville, and he belongs to the Belleville Rotary Club. Here's the front of the club when it was finished, and a rather fuzzy shot of the interior. The building now houses a restaurant called Nooners, which you may have been to. Smale's Pace quickly became a center for folk and roots music here in London, and Bev and I hung out there a lot. I played the Hub and Smale's Pace quite frequently along with many other performers, including Willie P. Bennett, David Essig, David Bradstreet, Laura Smith, and Stan Rogers, all people who eventually rose to prominence in the Canadian music scene. It was during those years that, because of the increasing tug that music was having on me, I started to look seriously at my life's direction. I knew that chemical engineering was just not doing it for me, and it was clear that music was the thing that really turned my crank. One day I sat down, and in true engineering style, I plotted myself on a graph showing the interests and aptitudes and how they intersected with certain professional career directions, and in the end of the exercise it became clear that my ideal profession was that of being a record producer. The aforementioned Stan Rogers was over to my house that evening, and I announced to him that I was going to be a record producer, and he said to me, "Well, when you're a record producer, you can produce my records." And we drank to that. One day in 1971, I learned that CBC Radio was looking to fill a music producer position, and I immediately applied for it. I remember traveling on a bus to Toronto for the interview and reading a book on how to produce music recordings. At that point, I had done a little bit of that kind of work in a small studio here in London called Track 4 Productions, but I wanted to be ready for any high-tech questions they might toss my way. The interview went well, and while I didn't get that particular job, a couple of months later another position came up and they offered it to me. I progressed far enough in my engineering studies to earn a master's degree, and I settled for that. And then in the spring of '72, Bev and I moved to Toronto, and I began my career as a music and record producer, a career that would keep me busy for the next 50 years. The early days at CBC Radio were fascinating. In the fall of '73, the resident jazz music producer was relocating to Winnipeg, so I was appointed the new network jazz producer, in spite of the fact that I knew zip about jazz. I was a folkie. Anyway, I learned on the job, producing a weekly network jazz show called Jazz Canadiana. One of the musicians that I worked with in those years was Phil Nimmins, who had a 16-piece jazz band called Nimmins and 9+6. In February of 1973, I was assigned to produce an album with that band and a featured soloist, the amazing Oscar Peterson. It was a recording of Peterson's composition called the Canadiana Suite, which Nimmins had arranged for his big jazz band. And that, folks, was the very first album I ever produced. Talk about baptism by fire. Fortunately, Phil and Oscar were kind souls and great to work with. Later in the spring of that year, I was assigned to cover a tour of Canada's biggest singing star, Anne Murray, in Canada's northern communities. The reasoning behind the tour was that these remote communities would never get to see this iconic Canadian star in concert. So the public broadcaster would be true to its national mandate and take her to them. We chartered a private plane, which was called the Snowbird Express, and presented concerts with Anne and her whole band in Flin Flon, Churchill, Manitoba, and in Whitehorse, Yellowknife, and Inuvik in the Northwest Territories and Yukon. The front half of the plane was filled with all the sound and lighting gear for the concerts, plus all the band instruments and my recording equipment. The rest of the plane was all the people, quite a crowd. Anne and her band, my radio crew, a television crew, and various handlers and assistants. The opening act was John Allan Cameron, who you may have heard of, and here's a shot of him backstage in Inuvik with me and my recording engineer, Larry Morey. I recorded all the concerts, and from those recordings and interviews and actuality, I produced a 90-minute radio special, which was very well received. It was great getting to know Anne and her gang, and here's us on the plane having a laugh about something or other, I don't know. I even ended up with a document certifying that I had crossed the Arctic Circle, signed by Anne herself. There it is. After that whirlwind beginning to my CBC radio career, I decided to try and promote the idea of a national radio show featuring the music I knew best, folk. Together with the writer who had worked with me on the Anne Murray project, Doug Lennox, I pitched the idea for a show called Touch the Earth. It would be a 90-minute weekly folk music program featuring primarily Canadian artists with a combination of discs and live recordings and artist interviews and documentary content exploring what's behind the music. And we wanted to feature primarily Canadian folk artists and their stories behind the music. They bought the idea, and one of the first tasks we tackled was to find an appropriate host. And one of the first names that came to mind was the Canadian folk music legend, Sylvia Tyson. Here's a picture of her and I in the studio. So I actually, I found out that her work with the husband, Ian Tyson, was winding down at that point, and I heard that she actually was exploring the possibility of doing some work on radio. So I approached her with the idea, and she agreed to come on as host of our new program. Perfect. Also, my co-conspirator, Doug Lennox, came on as co-host, along with my good friend Bill Garrett, presenting a different songwriter each week. Touch the Earth was on the air for 5.5 years, from the fall of '74 through to the spring of 1980. And we did a lot to promote this genre of music, giving it national radio exposure. The show traveled across the country several times, recording folk festivals, concerts, and artists sometimes in their own homes, some of the pictures here. And bringing folk music to a national audience. I don't think that it's a coincidence that it was during those years that the number of folk festivals starting up in Canada sharply increased. As a matter of fact, the show played a big role in the startup of one of Canada's most prestigious festivals, the Winnipeg Folk Festival. As I was planning our first season on Touch the Earth and looking for content, I was told by a Winnipeg producer that a festival was starting up there. The lineup looked terrific, and I negotiated the broadcast rights with the head of the festival, Mitch Podolak. Here's a fun picture of me with Mitch, Doug Lennox in the back there, and John Allan Cameron, taken at that very first Winnipeg Folk Festival. Mitch later told me that it was the CBC support that allowed him to secure the rest of the funding he needed to get the festival off the ground. We recorded at that first Winnipeg Folk Festival in the summer of '74 and broadcast a 2-part radio special in our first season. Over the next 5.5 years, a number of festivals sprung up across the country, in Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, Owen Sound, and right here in London, the Home County Folk Festival. I like to think that Touch the Earth played a role in that. It was also during those years in the '70s that I began my career as an independent record producer outside of my work at CBC Radio. One of the first significant artists that I produced was this guy, Stan Rogers. that I mentioned earlier. I had met Stan here in London when I was performing at the University Coffee House, the Hub. I was accompanying a singer named Mary Chapman, and we were the feature act. Stan was the opening act. We became friends that night, and 5 years later, when he had decided to make his first album, by the way, with Mitch Podalik's financial support, he asked me to produce it, true to the toast that we had made in my living room. We recorded the album in a studio near London here called Springfield Sound. The recording went well, and Stan's songs were nothing short of brilliant. And the players on the recording sessions were fabulous. Stan rose to some prominence over the next few years. I ended up producing 5 albums with Stan, and he became a major figure in the world of folk music. Shortly after completing the 5th album, the one in the center there, From Fresh Water, in 1983, he was tragically killed in an airplane accident in Cincinnati, Ohio. It was a terrible fire. His music has continued to live on, and he is generally regarded as being one of the best singer-songwriters Canada has ever produced. It was truly an honor to have worked with him. Meanwhile, back in the CBC in the early 80s, I moved over to the radio drama department for 3 years, an interesting departure from music production. And then in 1983, work was beginning on planning a new CBC building in Toronto. At the time, CBC occupied 26 different buildings scattered all over Toronto, and the feeling was strong that it would make sense to consolidate the operation into one single building. I was approached by senior management and asked if I would be interested in being a part of the planning. Their reasoning was that I was an experienced radio program producer, but I also had a degree in engineering. Well, they felt this was a good combination for the job. Well, maybe my half-dozen years in the engineering field wasn't a complete waste of time after all. I agreed to the appointment and started work immediately as the person in charge of planning the part of the new building dedicated to radio, but also as part of the team planning the whole building. It was fascinating work, and the result was this wonderful building near the CN Tower in Toronto, which opened in 1992, boasting state-of-the-art radio and television studios and world-class architecture. It was interesting that the planning was being done just at the time when digital technology in sound and video was just beginning to be introduced. Remember that the very first CDs didn't appear until 1983, and the digital production technology behind the scenes was just in its infancy. I learned a lot which would serve me well in the years to come. I was very proud of the radio facilities I had helped to create, including a state-of-the-art performance studio with a seating capacity of 300 and fabulous acoustics. We decided to name it after Canada's famous classical pianist, Glenn Gould. The Glenn Gould studio continues to this day as a revered performance space, but sadly, because CBC is doing much less original music programming, it is mostly used by outside groups. Sad. As all of this was going on, I continued to produce records on the side. One of the better-known acts to approach me in the mid-'80s was the world-famous children's act Sharon, Lois and Bram. My first project with them was a live album called 1, 2, 3, 4 Live, and they were so pleased with the results that they kept me on, and I produced about a dozen albums with them over the years. Here's us celebrating the finishing up of that live album with the recording engineer Chad Urshik in my living room in Toronto. I also acted as the musical director for their television series Skin and Rink TV along with Bill Garrett, and for a television special they did to celebrate 25 years as children's entertainers called 25 Years of Skin and Rink. Interestingly, one of the guests on that show was Denny Doherty of the Mamas and Papas, and here he is rehearsing California Dreaming with Sharon, Lois and Bram in my rec room, and it was almost like having the Mamas and Papas right there in my house. It was great. Moving into the 90s, the CBC Broadcast Center work was finishing, and I was put into management at CBC Radio. I became the director of planning. I was not enjoying it. Finally, in 95, I said to Bev that I needed to follow my heart again and go into record production full-time. Once again, she gave me her full support, So I quit my high-paying executive job at CBC to produce folk music records full-time. What? One of the first things I got involved with was the startup of a record label called for Canadian folk music, along with Ken Whiteley, Grit Laskin, and Bill Garrett. It was called Borealis Records. It's a label that still exists today, although I'm no longer involved, but it's become a real promoter of Canadian folk music. I also decided to build my own home recording studio. Digital technology made that possible because the price of recording equipment was not as steep as when everything was recorded to tape. Instead of having to spend about $20,000 on a multi-track tape recorder, now all you needed was a computer. So I'll never forget when I told Bev that I wanted to build a home studio that would cost us $10,000. She insisted that I write a business case. Of course, she was right, and I did what she asked, after which she gave me her wonderful support. So I built the studio in our home and called it the Millstream, and I started to build the business. Once again, I was in my element and doing good work as a result. Over the next 20 years, I would go on to record over 120 albums in that home studio. Here are some pictures from some of the recording sessions that we did at the Millstream. Ron Hynes, the well-known Newfoundland songwriter, I did 3 albums with him in the studio. My favorite drummer, Al Cross, and there's Jeff Healy, famous guitar player, blues player, and so on, with another guy that I was producing, Terry Kelly, a great songwriter from Nova Scotia. Laura Smith, who I'd mentioned earlier, I first met her at Smale Space here in London. Sadly, she passed away a couple of years ago. My favorite bass player, Dennis Pendrith. Tony McManus, playing the weirdest guitar you've ever seen. He was the guitar player on Laura's record, and we also had a string quartet along with her. And I did an album with a guy named Dave Hadfield, and here he is singing some harmonies with his brother Chris. And you may know Chris Hadfield better as an astronaut than a singer. But it was one of the sorry, just let me catch up here. One of the more interesting projects that came my way during that period was actually working with Chris Hadfield while he was on the International Space Station. One of the main songs that we did was a song called Is Somebody Singing, which Chris had co-written with Ed Robertson and of the Bare Naked Ladies rock band. So we decided to produce this song with the Bare Naked Ladies, and Chris and Ed would sing back and forth on the song. Here's a shot of us in the control room at CBC. This is one of the studios that I helped design at this broadcast center in Toronto. And here's a picture of the session. We had Ed and the Bare Naked Ladies, and then on the screen you see Chris, who's up in the International Space Station, singing along. And we had a youth choir. They were called the Wexford Gleeks from Wexford High School in Toronto. Fabulous choir. It was a great session. And there's Ed and Chris singing their duet together. It was an interesting and challenging project for sure, with lots of very complex logistics to figure out. But it came together beautifully, and the video that was shot during that recording session has received over 4 million views. All in all, as I look back on my life in music, I shake my head in wonderment at what following my heart did for me. That and the wonderful support that I received from my best friend and wife, Bev, led me to a life full of satisfaction, richness, and emotional wealth. In addition to my work as a producer and musician, I was also honored to have served on a number of boards associated with the world of folk music, including Folk Music Ontario, Folk Music Canada, the Canadian Folk Music Awards, and, as Ian mentioned, the Home County Music and Art Festival. All of this has led not only to immense personal satisfaction, but recognition through awards such as the Order of Canada and my recent induction into the London Music Hall of Fame. I'm just so thrilled at this recognition. Believe me, it's amazing. So thank you very much for indulging me as I shared my life's journey with you all. And thanks again to the Rotary Club of London for inviting me to speak today.
Wonderful. I think we will open everything up for questions now. So if you want to raise your hand, if you have a question, use the reaction button in Zoom to raise your hand and feel free to ask a question.
Just don't ask any hard questions, okay?
Okay, well, while everybody's kind of composing their thoughts, I want to understand the logistical challenges of producing the Chris Hadfield special.
Yeah.
The logistical challenges involved just are mind-boggling to me.
Well,
so can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, for starters, it is quite impossible to, in spite of what it looked like in the studio, it's impossible to do it live because of there's a significant delay between the two. So what happened was I had Ed do kind of a demo of the song in his home studio, guitar and a click track, like a metronome. And I sent that up to Chris, and we decided what lines Ed would sing and what lines Chris would sing. And Chris, up on the space station, recorded his parts to that demo that Ed produced. And so he sang his lines and played his guitar and sent those tracks down to me. And then I put that, and then we had him do a video, and he was playing along with himself, lip syncing to his own voice. And that's what the video that you saw on the screen in the studio. And then what happened was we played that video with Chris's recording in the studio, and the Bare Naked Ladies and the choir played along with that live. So that's how it all came together. But it was interesting. I was in touch with Chris up on the ISS through email and all that stuff. I had special clearance and stuff. It was fascinating. It really was.
Wonderful. Jim Swan, you had a question.
Yeah, Paul, a fantastic presentation, and it makes us proud as Londoners to know that you have made such a contribution to music across Canada. But you mentioned that CBC isn't doing as much live music presentations and production. Can you just comment a little bit on that and why it's happened, and whether or not there is some substitute for that?
Well, it's a good question, and I wish I had the definitive answer, other than to say that in the 90s, the CBC budgets started to get slashed every year, and they continued to be slashed through the 2000s and so on. So they lost a lot of financial resources during those years, and that was part of the reason why they couldn't afford to do a lot of music production, because that's very expensive work. It's very sad to say that those great music recording studios that I helped design in the Broadcast Center are all gone. And the CBC occupies, I think, about half of that building now. It's very, very sad. And I wish there was a way to somehow get it back, because it is part of the Broadcast Act that this public broadcaster must be in a position to promote the arts. And it just isn't doing it as well as it used to.
Has commercial production replaced any of that, do you think?
Well, the whole internet thing has certainly been a factor. Music is much more readily available to everybody. So there's sort of, it's cut into the mandate of the CBC to deliver Canadian music to Canadians. That's being done by the artists themselves out of their bedrooms. And so I think that's a factor for sure.
Ian, you had a question.
I know Paul didn't say this, but I want to say it because he is still a very active performing musician and also a producer of great concerts. So I want to let you all know that Paul and his great friend David Bradstreet are performing a concert on Sunday, April 24th at the Cuckoo's Nest Folk Club at Chaucer's. Start time at 7:30. And if anybody wants tickets, please contact me. I'll be happy to provide you with tickets. They do a great show. And also Paul is producing Rise Again, the music of Stan Rogers, at Aeolian Hall on the holiday weekend in May May 20th and 21st, and has a really fine lineup. And maybe Paul could let you know who the players are on that show. And it's sure to sell out. It's been done a few times, and in Toronto for many years. And finally, Paul brought the show to London. So maybe Paul could just elaborate on who's performing in that show.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the Cuckoo's Nest gig big time. Dave and I have a good time together, and so looking forward to that. And yes, the Stan Rogers tribute show, Rise Again, at Aeolian. It was postponed twice. It's a presentation by Home County, by the way, and so hopefully it'll go ahead on May 20th and 21st. Ariel Rogers, who was Stan's wife, is featured in the show, along with the well-known singer-songwriter James Keelahan, Alison Lupton. Tanis Slimman is joining us, and Ariel's husband, Scott Cameron Smith, is going to be part of it, along with myself. And we've got a fabulous band with David Woodhead on bass. He played with Stan for a number of years. Tom Layton on keyboards, and I'm having a senior moment. The fiddler,
Shane Cook.
Shane Cook, of course, is
London's own.
Yeah, London's own Shane Cook, one of the best fiddlers in the world. Sorry, Shane. Anyway, looking forward to that show big time. We'll do. It's all Stan Rogers songs, and there's certainly a lot of wonderful songs to choose from. And we've done the show at Aeolian before, and it's been a sellout. So hopefully it'll be again.
Malcolm, you have a question.
Yes, I do. Paul, thanks for the presentation. Just great to hear about all those names from our collective pasts. My question's about the City of London becoming perhaps, or hopefully, a center for music. I mean, this could be Nashville of the North, but there seems to be no dedication by anyone in the City Hall or the powers that be to sort of fulfill that idea, because the city's looking for something that would be it. What's it known for? And I think music would be one of the best areas for us to celebrate and be part of. So any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I have to tell you that I think that the city government is doing a lot. There is something called the London Music Office, which is headed up by a guy named Corey Crossman, and they are doing a fabulous job. For example, the Folk Music Ontario organization that I belong to does an annual conference where artists showcase. And Corey has had a showcase of London artists at that conference for a number of years. So he does stuff like that. He promotes London artists at various conferences. And I think he was a big mover and shaker in getting London named as a UNESCO World Music City. I don't know how many of you know that, but it is now, it is the first Canadian city to be named a UNESCO Music City of the world. Here we are.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Rick Coates.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Paul. And I really enjoyed it. I'm a big believer in following your gut, or as you pointed, following your heart. So I've rarely found that when my gut says something and somebody is pulling me another direction, I follow my gut, and it pretty well always works out right. So having said that, did you ever get a chance to circle back to your guidance counselor and have a chat with him?
No, I'm afraid I didn't. I can't even remember his name, I'm afraid. It's just one of those distant memories. He was doing his job, you know. I mean, he was giving me sage advice about the risks of going into the arts, and he was absolutely right. It's one of the toughest professions in which to make a living. But no, I don't remember his name, and I can't get back to him.
But as we know, sometimes the risks are what make life enjoyable.
Yeah, it kind of makes you work harder, I think, you know, and it certainly worked out for me. Yeah.
Howard, you have a question.
I just have two comments, if I may. One is that Ian, I'm sure, would be happy to sell you a ticket to an event on May 6th featuring Shane Cook. So I'm sure he'd be happy to have you as a guest at his table. My other comment is more a thank you, that I'm not from Southern Ontario originally. I come from the East Coast, and I would not have known much of the history of the area if it wasn't for the music of Stan Rogers. So I want to thank you for that. I learned a lot about the geography. I still am. And I think he was a wonderful musician and an incredible songwriter, and provided a lot of knowledge on the Canadian scene from coast to coast, really. So thank you for that.
Oh, well, it was an honor, as I said. If you're not familiar with Stan's music, I would invite you to get familiar, because he, as you mentioned, he wrote a lot about Canada. He didn't write love songs and the usual kinds of songs like that. He wrote about the people and the events of Canada. He started out on the East Coast, became well known for that, and then he wrote a bunch of songs about the West and the North. And that last album, From Fresh Water, is songs that he wrote about the province that he grew up in, Ontario. And he said to me when we started that album, he says, I got to fill the gap in the map. And so it's all songs about Ontario.
Wonderful. Well, I would also like to thank you, Paul. You brought a lot of different things to life, the things that I've heard about or things that I've seen, but now I have a much better understanding of, much better picture of. It was a great presentation. So I'm echoing a lot of our club members in thanking you for your presentation today. And,
Thank you so much.
And in recognition of your presentation today to our club, a contribution has been made to the Polio Plus campaign of the Rotary Foundation to immunize 50 infants against polio. And because of you, Rotary is now one step closer to a polio-free world. So once again, thank you very much. It was great, and hopefully we'll get to see you at our Rotary Ranch Party coming up in May.
Thanks very much.
Next week's meeting will be, our speaker will be Professor Else Peters from the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Western. There, as mentioned last week at our meeting, or based on the feedback at last week's meeting, there is going to be a special meeting, and we're going to leverage the Satellite Club's regular meeting next Tuesday, March the 22nd, for a special presentation on what is happening in the Ukraine. And it will be Tatiana Antonenko doing that presentation. And many of you will remember Tatiana from when she was the president of the Fanshawe Rotaract Club. So it will be an interesting one. I will be sending out more information on that. Just waiting for a copy of Tatiana's bio. And I'll be sending out more information on both that special presentation next Tuesday, as well as different ways to contribute to help with the ongoing situation in the Ukraine. Rotary International has set up a special fund, and I want to make sure everybody's aware of that. And there are other ways to also help out and contribute to the situation in Ukraine. We also have a board meeting this week, Wednesday, March 16th at 5 p.m. Cocktail hour. It will be open tomorrow. I unfortunately will not be able to attend the President's Cocktail Hour. We will be returning home from Mexico tomorrow afternoon, and Coffee Klatch is Thursday at 10:30. And I believe that is everything for our meeting for today. Thank you, everyone. And just a quick reminder that we in Rotary serve to change lives, and I hope everyone has a great week. Thank you.